Hello and welcome to question and answer number 25. And 25, if you didn't know, is kind of a big number. We're getting up there. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And before doing this show, my sweetheart asked me to try and look alive and perky. But the thing is, for the past week or so, I've been um, feeling kind of washed out. I think it's like the spring has sprung and the pollen in the air is thick. And so my body is dealing with clouds of pollen in the air or something. But I'll try to look alive, and if I don't look alive, you can just consider that to be some sort of error in your own perceptions or something. And we've got not like a huge number of questions, but we're into double digits easily. And some of these questions are complicated. I'm not entirely sure if I understand the question. So let's just dive in here and see what happens. So the first question is from Matthew. And Matthew says, there seems to be two ways of explaining not self. One is that reality as we perceive it is an illusion, and thus all we experience is essentially a simulation, or two, that it is a practical way to differentiate between a false sense of certainty about perceived phenomena and the underlying reality that can be properly experienced when not self is properly understood. And in parentheses, he's got C. Panchavagi, Five Brethren, also known as the Anattalakkhana Sutta, the discourse on the not self characteristic. The first approach seems more exoteric, while the second approach is more grounded. Do you agree that this dichotomy exists? And if so, what do you think is the more useful for lay householders? Well, technically, there are more than two ways of explaining not self. Like the Anattalakkhana Sutta pretty much goes with the idea that if you don't have complete control over something, you can't really say that it's you. So, since we don't have complete control over the five khandhas, which is our body, our feelings, our perceptions, let's see, our volitions, our karma formations, and our consciousness. Since we don't have complete control over any of that, we can't say that any of that is really ourself. But there have been other ways of interpreting no self. For example, one of the most famous ways is the simile of the chariot, where you've got a chariot is composed of parts. And I mean, none of those parts is really the chariot. If you took all the parts apart and had them in a pile, that also wouldn't be a chariot. You can swap out parts and it's still considered to be the same chariot. So the chariotness of the chariot isn't abiding in any particular part. And it's really just a term of convenience for a certain assemblage of parts. So that's considered to be one of the standard explanations of not self. Although Abhidhamma went with the idea that anything that can be divided into smaller parts is not self. Still, it's sort of it creates the problem of any elemental particle could be called a self, even though according to Abhidhamma it lasts only about a trillionth of a second. But there you are. And then in Mahayana, even those elementary particles can be divided in the imagination. There's like the top half and the bottom half of the elementary particle, which could be considered different from each other, and so forth. And then also Mahayana went with what Matthew here says is the first interpretation, is that reality as we perceive it is simply an illusion. And that is implied in a lot of Theravada Buddhism also. So, so Matthew has this dichotomy that not self is due to the fact that the whole world is an illusion, or that we are just perceiving the world incorrectly. But that it amounts to the same thing, really. I mean, there's at least a lot of overlap between these two interpretations. And really, my interpretation of no self just goes back to my standard simile of the block of marble, where reality is just this formless, reality is formless, and that it is perception that is dividing things up and creating duality. And the perception is imagination, essentially. So, yeah. Let's see. Do you agree that this dichotomy exists? Kind of, sort of. And if so, which do you think is the more useful for lay householders? Whichever interpretation resonates. Some people just have different characteristics, different characters, different personalities, and so different approaches to the same issue will resonate better with different people. So, whatever works best for the individual, there's several different interpretations of no self, which does indicate that it is a difficult concept to understand, mainly because it's just not intellectual. The intellect works in terms of duality. So once you start intellectualizing or trying to figure it out, you've already lost because, the best you can do is sort of some kind of Kantian recognition of the limitations of your own perceptual system or something. So yeah, I'll just go with whatever works best for you to help you detach from whoever you think you are, because you are not that. So the next question is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, Panyo, can you tell any stories of supernatural powers you may have come across yourself or in other monks in your next Q&A? Well, I really don't have a lot of luck with supernatural powers. Supernatural powers in myself, what might be called supernatural powers, have tended to be just I'll say something that another person just happens to be thinking at that moment, and it just happens quite a lot sometimes. And it's I don't know, it's like weird synchronicities or something. And so there is that. I mean, when I was a kid, we had a poltergeist in our house. And the most famous story of that is my father was hiring a housekeeper for the summer, and we were the three of us were sitting at the kitchen table. My father at one end, I was at the other end, and the housekeeper was like sort of kitty corner from my father. And on the corner of the kitchen table was an ashtray. And my father was explaining to the housekeeper that if she finds any kind of broken glassware or crockery, broken dishes in the cupboards, anything like that, don't immediately blame the kids, because there is a poltergeist in the house, and dishes and glassware and so forth spontaneously just deconstruct. And while he was explaining this to her, her eyebrow, like one eyebrow, was starting to go up, and she's like starting to get this slow grin on her face, like she can't decide whether he's joking or crazy. And then within 5 seconds of him reaching the end of the sentence, explaining how there was a poltergeist, the ashtray that was on the just right there in plain sight made this sound like zink, and just split in half, and the two halves split, just kind of slid like an inch apart from each other. And then she immediately stopped smiling and started taking him seriously. Um, Although, with regard to supernatural powers of like sages and so forth, um, I heard that Shui Uminsiado in Burma, who has now passed away, that he could read minds. And I've been told that there's a really famous monk in Thailand who can read minds. Although I never met any monk personally that, well, I did meet Shui Uminsiado once, but he didn't read my mind at the time. So let's see. I saw an apparition once. Could have been a ghost. Could have been some kind of weird, some sort of aberration in my brain at the moment. I don't know. Um, Gosh, yeah, that's about it. I don't have very good luck with regard to cultivating supernatural powers, except for, as I say, like weird coincidences happen. Like the more you practice spiritually, the more weird coincidences are going to happen. At least that's my experience. Um, yeah. So really, I don't. I'm sorry to disappoint Joe Doe here, but I really do not have a rich repertoire of supernatural power stories. Um, in my case, as I've said, it's usually spontaneous and just without my conscious control or knowledge. It just happens. So I think I'll just move on to the next question, and this is from In Manus, who asks complicated questions. So let's see how it goes here. In Manus says, "How did they translate ancient languages like Pali? How can we be sure that the meaning or connotation is accurate from the time that the language was used more commonly compared to how we translate it now? And how should people who have never studied ancient languages approach any translation? Suppose the first translation that all subsequent translations is based was off on just a handful of key terms. Suppose our own knowledge paradigm had also, in a sense, influenced the original thought paradigm by which the old language arose. Even if the translators were well intending in their efforts, the practice will sort it out, perhaps. So that's the first question, which really it boils down to just how can you translate Pali or any other ancient language and be sure that the translation is more or less correct. And I would point out that even like Shakespeare, there are passages in Shakespeare that are hotly contended that nobody's really sure what Shakespeare had in mind. So there could be just figures of speech that were used in ancient times that just fell out of fashion and is difficult to understand. Um, One thing I've noticed is the commentaries really are relatively clueless with regard to flora and fauna and probably customs that are peculiar to northern India, because the commentaries were written in Sri Lanka and southern India by monks who maybe had little or no experience with northern India. But on the bright side, a language like Pali, there is a living tradition extending all the way back to the Buddha. So you had monks who were, reading, understanding, interpreting the Pali. I mean, in the early times, they probably spoke Pali fluently. Um, and so the tradition just continues. And so the commentaries are probably mostly correct, mostly reliable. Um, Even though they're probably composed mainly by scholar monks who didn't meditate much, but they were relying upon older traditions that were passed down for, many centuries. So some of it you can verify for yourself. Some of it is just common sense. Some of it you really can't be sure about. Like in the Vinaya, the rules of monastic discipline, sometimes there's just a word in the Pali language that appears just once in the entire Pali Tipitaka, and you can't figure it out just from context. It's like a monk is forbidden to use such and such, but it doesn't really explain what such and such is. And sometimes, excuse me, the commentators will just make wild stabs in the dark, and sometimes the commentators are wrong, and sometimes they're spectacularly wrong, even with regard to basic philosophy. Although I hope that is rare. Like the term papancha, it's it's an important philosophical term in Buddhism that the commentators like Buddhaghosa really didn't know what it meant, and so there was a monk. Oh, I can't remember his name. I've got the book behind me on the shelf, but I don't want to interrupt myself. But it's called, let's see, something in reality. Gosh, maybe I should get it. Just a second. Oh, let's see here. Here we go. Ah, almost fell down. Kicked the chair. Okay, Concept and Reality in Early Buddhist Thought by Bhikkhu Nyanananda, where he does this really deep scholarly analysis of the term papancha and concludes that it means something like diversification, like taking something simple and artificially complicating it with all these connotations and so forth. And that is a symptom of ignorance, really, in Buddhism. So I guess with regard to, let's see, there's other part of the question here. How should people who have never studied ancient languages approach any translation? Um, I have found with regard to Pali texts, the best translations into English are going to be by Western monks. Like Westerners who are just scholars, it's like an alien tradition for them. They haven't lived the life. They're going to be making lots of wild guesses and using sort of, Western liberal, semi-Christian common sense to try and interpret ancient Indian Buddhism, and it doesn't always work out very well. CAF Rhys Davids is a spectacular failure in that regard, in my opinion. And then, like Asian monks who translate usually have more of a medieval faith-oriented mindset where they'll slavishly follow the commentaries, and they'll just tell you what the commentary says, even if it says something different from what the Pali says. It's like if the Buddha says red and the commentary says, well, when the Buddha said red, what he really meant was blue, then they'll just follow along with blue as a general rule. So a Western monk is usually the best translator. Bhikkhu Bodhi, I mean, regardless of his leftist hysteria and so forth, um, he's one of the best translators we've got. Bhikkhu Nyanamoli is a really good translator. His friend Bhikkhu Nyanavira was a good translator, although he didn't publish any large works, but his translations were good. Ajahn Thanisaro is good, although he's kind of self-indulgent in his translations and kind of follows some idiosyncratic renderings, especially in when he translates verses. But yeah, you just have to have faith in Dhamma that the gist of it will come across, even if you miss out on a few terms. The genuine original meaning has been lost. Even some terms like nama rupa. I really do think that nama rupa originally was as it is literally translated, name and form. As you got the form of something, you see something and you sort of focus in on the form of it, and then you slap a name onto it. You give it meaning. First you see the object, you focus on the object, and then you attribute some meaning to that. Even if it's just what the hell is that? Still, it's some kind of meaning. So later on, the tradition changed Namarupa to mind and matter. But I think originally, and some of the oldest texts do seem to bear this out, in the new Upanishadic tradition, it's like this also, that it really does. It's like a description of how perception works. Like papancha sankha is another, it's similar, where papancha is you differentiate, and then sankha is you attribute some kind of significance to what you have differentiated out from the plenum of the sensory field or whatever. So one good thing that you can do is just read the text. I mean, if you can learn Pali, that would help. But you read the text and don't rely too much on like preconceived notions or commentarial traditions, and just let it fall to place in your own mind and make sense of it. I mean, in some respects, it's better to trust your own common sense in reading something than relying slavishly on the commentaries, because the commentaries aren't always right, especially in the ways that I mentioned before. But let's just move on to the next question from Inmanis, which is a complicated one, and it's about mysticism. So the first part of this one is metaphysics as compared to practical mysticism. Could Punyo explain the primary differences? Well, metaphysics is very different from mysticism because metaphysics is intellectual. It's an intellectual attempt to understand ultimate reality, whereas mysticism is not intellectual, and the purer it gets, it's not even perceptual. It's just wide open consciousness, and so it's essentially formless in the pure state. So like any jhanic state, any jhana above first jhana, where you're no longer thinking, could be called mysticism. So fourth jhana would be like the perfection of mysticism for an unenlightened being. And metaphysics is philosophizing, is trying to use the intellect to understand ultimate reality. And of the two, mysticism is far preferable because you're just experiencing reality directly instead of filtering it through perceptions and just intellectuality and so forth. So the next part of this question on mysticism by Inmanis. Also, I have heard you mention before, when perhaps discussing Venerable Nyanamoli, that he hated mysticism and that mysticism cannot be systematized. Correct me if I'm off. What exactly is practical mysticism then? Is practice not in any way systematized? Also, what do we make of the various seemingly systems of categorical practice that are so prevalent in Buddhism? For instance, with regard to practice, there are the bojjhangas, or factors of enlightenment, and also the formula of purification laid out in the Four Right Efforts, to name a few. So before I continue with the question, I'll address this part. First, it wasn't Nyanamoli who hated mysticism, it was Nyanavira. And Nyanavira was just a towering intellectual. He was trying to interpret Dhamma more or less in accordance with 20th century existentialism, or late 19th century, like Kierkegaard. He's very strongly influenced by the existentialists. And he had this this radically complicated intellectual understanding of Dhamma that he it was weird. It was like he said that anybody who is unenlightened has this problem, and then he just launches into this complicated stuff that most people couldn't even fully understand. And supposedly even a frog has these subtle, you know, just maladjustments of perception or some such. He actually thought that he had become a sotapanna just by walking back and forth philosophizing, just doing his walking meditation, just trying to figure out Dhamma. So he hated mysticism just because it wasn't logical. Mysticism is not logical. Like, he just absolutely insisted on, the Aristotelian laws of thought. You have A is A, which is the law of identity. A is not A, which is the law of, what is it, difference? I don't remember. And then there's A has to be either B or not B, something like that, which is the law of excluded middle. And he just said, if you don't think according to these rules, you're fucked, essentially. You're wrong. And then he said mysticism is like that because mystics talk in paradoxes mainly because they're trying to get you to stop thinking, like a Zen koan. It's like, does a dog have Buddha nature? It's, there is no answer to it really. The answer that Joshu gave was mu, which is, or in original Chinese, it's wu, which could just be that he was barking like a dog for all I know. But it just means like no, but it's not no in that a dog doesn't have Buddha nature. He's just like, no, don't ask the question. So let's see, I've gone off the track here. Let's see. Jnanavira hated mysticism because he was just a hardcore intellectual. He had zero use for any kind of mystical state. So apparently he had zero use for jhana, anything above first jhana. Let's see. Mysticism cannot be systematized. Well, intellectually, the states or intellectually pure mysticism it doesn't fit the system because pure mysticism would be like God. It would just be formless and infinite and thereby paradoxical. But what can be systematized is the practice, how to cultivate jhana states, for example. See, what exactly is practical mysticism? Yeah, it would be just the cultivation of mystical states, which would be through meditation. I mean, there's other ways you could go about it through, taking, entheogenic substances, so to speak, or in the West, often it happens accidentally through like a near-death experience or some such. So the practice can be systematized, but a pure, how do you say, just like a pure mystical state. Yeah, it really just defies systematization, like nibbana defies systematization. Let's see. So, okay, all right. I think I answered that part. So I'll move on to the next part of the question here. I believe there should be a balance of mysticism with practice, and while intellect can also be taken to an extreme, which is probably the case with most Westerners, I feel mysticism can also be taken too far. With the middle way, I think balance between the two are probably most helpful. Mysticism is generally arrived at as such experiences are conditioned. Most worldlings come from a position of a predominant intellect and sense base and must use those faculties to also quell those faculties to penetrate to the more formless and refined planes of mystic experience. It's not exactly a question, this part, but I can comment on a little bit. The Zen practitioners seem to go with the idea of a balance of mysticism and practice. It's possible even like some of the early texts, like I think it might be the very first verse of the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha is talking about, not running and not sinking. And it's sort of like a paradox, what's the meaning? Or not a paradox, like an enigma. What did he mean? You don't run, you don't sink. And I think it could be you're not running just running through samsaric states, just thinking, living in samsara. But at the other hand, on the other hand, you're not sinking into like this blank trance state. That you have to balance those. And Ramana Maharshi, he was a Hindu, but he was a very advanced Hindu. And he couldn't talk for the first few years after he reached his experience, his enlightenment experience, supposedly. It took him a few years before he was able to start integrating, worldly states with this formless bliss that he was experiencing. For a while, I mean, he could hardly eat. People would just have to put food in his mouth. He was really out of it for a long time because he really didn't know how to integrate, the two. They seemed so just diametrically opposed or just so alien to each other. Um, so, I mean, if you're going to function in the world, a balance between the two is helpful, but it's more a matter of, I mean, be as mystical as you can because mysticism is really like direct experience of reality. If it's like deep, high contemplation, as the Catholic mystics call it. Um, so let's just move on to the next part of the question here. How would a mystic be able to declare that he knows or has attained to? It would be, it has been stated that once the aspirant practitioner has made it to fruition of any of the stages of enlightenment, then in most cases they know. Also, such types generally see the causal factors which lead to that knowing. In the case of a disciple, they would know that their teacher and the teaching was right and good, and this bolsters their faith to a conviction that is unshakable. Well, most of the people that I have met who consider themselves to be Aryas, in my opinion, were mistaken. So there is that. But with regard to knowing and just believing, samsara is just a matter of belief. Any kind of perceptual knowledge is just belief. It's not the same as knowledge. Knowledge is direct experience of reality, and you're starting to get some of that in a mystical state. So it's just gonna be like a different level of reality, just a whole different dimension. And it's going to be true knowledge as opposed to the beliefs that you've been wallowing through, since, infancy, I suppose. But with some people, they just can't deal with it. It's like, you have sort of a mild mystical state every time you sneeze. It's like you're wide awake and you're not thinking anything, but it's so brief and it's just so normal, I guess, that people really can't integrate that into their understanding of reality. So finally, in Manus, at the end of the mysticism question, and with regard to mysticism, what is the extreme? Is it the bhavanga consciousness being lived in and indulged in, a conditioned stupor, or perhaps a schizophrenic? Yeah, it would be none of those. The extreme of mysticism would be essentially nirvana. That would be the extreme, just being God or whatever. The bhavanga consciousness, that's just like, it's like a test pattern. According to Abhidhamma, your last conscious thought before you die is going to be like the test pattern of your mind, um, and like your subconscious mind throughout your next life. So if you're thinking of your family when you die, whenever you're unconscious, supposedly, you're in a deep sleep or something, it's just going to be this test pattern of the images of your family in your previous life. So that's obviously not mysticism. A conditioned stupor, no. Mysticism is expanded consciousness. It's like when you're perceiving something, you're limiting your consciousness to what you are perceiving. But when you're not perceiving anything and you're still wide awake, I mean, the consciousness is just wide open. Your mind is like a mirror or like a cheap camera where everything is equally in focus, but you're not really picking out anything. And a schizophrenic, I don't know. I don't know what the mind of a schizophrenic is like. I don't think it's particularly enlightened. A paranoid person is not particularly enlightened. So, yeah, what is the extreme of mysticism? It would just be like maybe Ramana Maharshi, right after he had his experience, when he was just completely zoned out. I mean, it was to an external observer, he might have been in a complete stupor, just totally out of it. But his experience would just be like, formless bliss. It's just infinity. Because perception is what creates limits. If you don't have limits, if consciousness is not perceiving something, assuming that you can even have consciousness without perception, then it's just formless. And if it's formless, it's infinite. So the next question is from Yuichiro. And this is a short question, but it's I don't fully understand it here, where it's just kind of a strange one. Why is solipsism wrong from first principles? Just sitting observing. Couldn't everything just be your own imagination? And then I asked him, when he asked me this question, what does he mean by first principles? And he says basic axioms, which it didn't really clarify it for me. So why is solipsism wrong from first principles? Shouldn't everything just be your own? Couldn't everything just be your own imagination? Well, your perceptions could be your own imagination, but if you just get beyond the perception, like in the mystical state, then the illusion really can't take hold because there's nothing for it to take hold of. So, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, solipsism is not necessarily wrong. I mean, there have been Buddhist schools, like one of the two main Mahayana schools is the Yogacara school, which, I mean, they're solipsists. You know, everything that you experience is the fruition of your own karma. And it's sort of like Leibniz's monads, where, how do I explain this? It's like, you know, it's like a monad is like its own little universe. And if all the other monads disappeared, it wouldn't, I mean, the first monad wouldn't even notice because it would still be living the whole world because it's all internalized. And the Yogacara Buddhists are like this. It's like your karma causes you to experience this certain world, but there are other people whose karma is like overlapping with yours, and it overlaps enough that it can seem as though they're interacting with you. So Mahayana took it that far, and you know, the seeds of that are already in Theravada. A lot of Mahayana's principles, um, you know, they're just developments of ideas that are found in Theravada, but not really elaborated upon. So, yeah, in a way, solipsism is, I mean, it's not wrong. I mean, we are living in a solipsist world, especially with regard to our interpretations of things, because that is just, you know, the meaning of something is just purely internal. It's just in your head. You know, there's no meaning out there. I mean, like this book, I mean, this is, even to just call it a book is like you're attributing significance to this. And I mean, if there was no perceiving mind, there wouldn't even be a this. You know, it wouldn't even get that far. It wouldn't even be a something. So, in a way, we are living in a solipsist world, but it's an infinite universe, and there are an infinite number of beings, and there are enough beings experiencing a universe similar to ours that we can seem, at least, to be interacting with them. And also, this isn't, some teachers say that this isn't true, but my own experience seems to indicate that it is true, is that if you have any kind of intimate connection with another person, then in a way your karma is sort of blending together and you're in a way creating a new being, like an us. You know, it's like you're very much in love with another person, and that person is very much in love with you, and you've got a good relationship going. So you've got this person, that person, and then there's this third being, which is the us. And then that can even be taken to higher levels, like an entire nation could sort of form an us at a loose level or something. So in that sense, solipsism wouldn't be correct. But at the level of the individual, yeah, we are pretty much living in a solipsism, at least with regard to the significance of everything that we perceive. But aside from that, I'm not sure how to answer that question. So the next question is from the Arya Suwasti Project. And the Arya Suwasti Project says, greetings Panyobasa. Question, could you elaborate a bit more on mindful meditation or being mindful in all activities? I am aware that being in the now is important for a number of reasons, not ruminating nor wasting time in daydreams, old memories, etc. But how can it have a significant impact on our spiritual evolution? It seems like a convenient practice since it can be done almost any time and anywhere. Can being completely mindful at a given time facilitate some level of enlightenment? Warm regards, Sadhu. Well, one really early kind of koan-like interpretation of mindfulness is in the Bahya Sutta of the Udana, where the Buddha is telling the wanderer Bahya, you know, in the seen there should be only the seen, in the heard there should be only the heard, in the felt there should be only the felt, in the mentally sensed there should be only the mentally sensed. And you're trying to be as close to the original datum as possible. You're not attributing significance. You know, you're not interpreting it. Like you hear a dog. If you hear a dog mindfully, like a dog's barking outside, if you hear the dog mindfully, you're just aware of the auditory sensations. You're not interpreting it as that damn dog just won't shut up. The neighbors should make him be quiet. Just on and on. You can do all this kind of stuff. But if you're being mindful and you hear the dog barking, it's just auditory sensation. If you're not that good at being mindful, then you can attribute some kind of significance to it as just sound or hearing. You want to keep it as basic as possible because you're trying to keep from just spinning off into papancha, spinning off into attributing all these solipsistic, interpretations, ultimately delusional interpretations. And so it's keeping you closer to reality. Like in Theravada Buddhism, the senses, just hearing is ultimately real, but the significance you attribute to the sounds are not ultimately real. So just going with Abhidhamma philosophy, by staying at the level of hearing and seeing and just feelings, physical sensations, and so forth, you're at the level of ultimate reality. In Mahayana, maybe not so much, but still, it is keeping you from spinning off into what is grosser delusion than just the hearing and the seeing and so forth. So that's one of the most important reasons of it. And it is a convenient practice since it can be done anytime. Like if you're walking, just be aware of like the oily sensation in your knee joints, or just the movements of your legs, the muscles in your thighs tightening and loosening, or the pressure of your feet against the ground and so forth. Just focus on that sort of thing. And it's still not the highest level of meditation, but it is much more advanced than just thinking about what you're going to have for lunch while you're walking, or whatever it happens to be, driving the car. You're feeling the steering wheel against your hands, and the seeing sensation, and the vibration of the car and everything, or brushing your teeth. Anything you do can be done mindfully. Some things are harder to do mindfully than others. um, Apparently, it seems to me, and I think it says this in the text also, it's harder to be mindful of pleasure than of pain, because you want to kind of detach from the pain, but the pleasure, you just naturally want to wallow in it. But yeah, it brings you closer to reality, and therefore it brings you closer to enlightenment in a number of ways. Just in the moment, you're closer to enlightenment just because you have reduced the amount of just deluded perceptions that you're wallowing in and considering to be reality. And also, you're just getting out of the habit of that. The more you restrain your thoughts, the more you just get into the habit of having restrained thoughts. So I think I'll just move on to the Arya Swasti Project's next question. And this one is a little bit confusing for me. Regarding state of mind, and he's even got mind in parentheses, so it's a state of, and then mind in parentheses, and then the whole thing in quotes. And being responsible for our own state of mind, or more specifically, suffering. I hope this doesn't sound too simple. Nope. But is body feeling, such as happiness or freedom of care, solely emotion and not linked with state of mind? Or is it an accurate gauge of state of mind? Let me say that sometimes I have some control over my own emotions, energy emotion, particularly with regular meditation and right diet, and prefer happiness or joy to lower and darker moods. My hope is that joy is an indicator of state of mind and that it is not independent of mind. I would qualify lastly that joy I'm speaking of is independent of material gain or other outside events. Much respect, Sadhu. There seems to be some confusion here. It's like, let's see up here. Is body feeling such as happiness or freedom of care solely emotion and not linked with state of mind? Well, emotion is a state of mind. You can say that there's a physical element too, but any kind of, let's just go with Abhidhamma. Probably you have an idea if you've watched my videos. They don't have much use for Abhidhamma, but just going with, it is Orthodox Theravada. It's the third Pitaka. So in Orthodox Theravada, you got four kinds of reality. You've got mind, mental states, consciousness, and nibbana. So consciousness is like, they really have it Theravada really has a difficult time defining consciousness. They really don't do a very good job of it, in my opinion. But the mental states is anything it's the form of the consciousness. Anything that the consciousness is conscious of is a mental state. So that would include all your vedanas, all your feelings, all your perceptions, everything. Anything that you experience is going to be a mental state, unless you can somehow attain the paradoxical state of having pure consciousness with no mental states, in which case you're in a pure mystical state. So I don't fully understand the question here because the Arya Swasti project seems to be assuming that emotions are different from mental states, in which case I'm not exactly sure what he means by state of mind. Um, but I will say that happiness is not just a state of mind. You can say, I mean, happiness, is mainly a state of mind, you can say, or love for that matter. But also, you have to have the consciousness underlying the mental state. It's like, this isn't exactly orthodox, disclaimer here, but like consciousness is like water, and mental states would be like waves. It's mental states are like the form that the consciousness assumes. So if you've got like a big mental state, you're going to have more consciousness behind it. If you have like an expanded mental state, like love or joy, then there's going to be more consciousness backing that up. You're more conscious when you're happy than when you're unhappy, as a general rule. There may be exceptions to that. But still, when you're wide open, your heart is open, you've got less restrictions on your consciousness, less restrictions on your heart, so to speak, then yeah, I mean, you're going to be more conscious. And so it's not purely a state of mind. Happiness or unhappiness are not purely states of mind, because there's also the underlying consciousness, which is the same consciousness, but it can be, expanded or contracted. Like a state of depression would be like chronic contraction of consciousness. You've got a small consciousness going. And just the more conscious you are, the happier you are, until finally you reach infinite bliss, when your consciousness just merges with the consciousness of the universe, so to speak. And for those Buddhists out there, please forgive me for talking so much like a Hindu. So I think I pretty much answered that one as well as I can. It's kind of a confusing question for me. So I'll just move on to the next one from Chaplin. And this one's down to earth. This is a down to earth question. Coming up soon on your 1 year disrobing anniversary, are we going to get another transitional update video? Well, that's possible. Yeah. If people want to find out how it's been not being a monk for a whole year, which will be May 16th, would be my anniversary for leaving the ordained Bhikkhu Sangha. So, yeah, it's possible. I think there's a good chance of it. So I'll just move on to the next question from Chaplin, and that is, looking back over the last year since disrobing, what 3 words would best describe your new life? What 3 words? Well, I think this would be in order of importance. It would be love, work, food. Those are like the 3 biggies. That would be the 3 words that best describe my existence. Love, work, and food. Or if there was a word that could combine love and intimacy, just being really close to another person, um, yeah, I would use that word instead of love. But love is a good word. Um, yeah. So I guess I answered the question. I mean, I could elaborate, but it might be TMI or something. So I'll just move on to the next question from Chakra Gosha. And this is a naughty question. How do you say the 14 words in Pali? Seriously. Um, for those of you who aren't into National Socialism or whatever, the 14 words, I had to look this up. So, I mean, it's not like I'm an authority on this, but I looked it up, and it's, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. And I'm not even going to attempt a translation. I'd probably butcher it because my Pali is pretty rusty now. And yeah, I mean, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. Gosh, yeah, I'm not even going to attempt it. I mean, Chakra Gosha knows some Pali. I think you can give it a shot yourself there. I think you're just being a naughty boy. That's what I think. So the next question from Chakra Gosha. There is a passage in the Samyutta Nikaya in which the Arahat Chana, apparently not the same person as the famous charioteer, chooses to commit suicide due to an incurable painful illness. Given the third noble truth, wouldn't an arahant be free from suffering even when undergoing a painful illness? Being free from suffering, why would he choose to kill himself? On the other hand, it seems like maybe the traditional view is that Chana was not an arahant yet when he chose to kill himself, but only achieved full awakening in the last moments as he bled to death. I'm not sure how plausible that interpretation of the story is. Well, Shakragosha seems to be overlooking the famous story in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta describing the Buddha's own death, where the Buddha was having really painful, like really just piercing abdominal pains, and he had to go into jhana in order to bear the pain more easily, which is had me thinking, like, I mean, an arahant shouldn't really experience suffering. I mean, they still experience pain, but then the pain wouldn't bother them because they wouldn't have aversion for the pain. So why would the Buddha, or a Chana in this case, resort to some method of not feeling the pain? And the best answer I could come up with is that your body and your mind are still linked. Like if you're really sick, it's going to have effects on your mind. Like, just if you're sick with whatever, you might things may taste bad. I've had fevers where even water tastes bad, everything tastes bad. And even an arahant, I mean, he might not be attached or identified with his body, but still, when the body's all messed up, the mental states accompanying that body are also going to be messed up, even though the arahant isn't really identified with that anymore. So that could be a way of answering that question. But yeah, the Buddha himself did something similar. He didn't kill himself, but he went into jhana when he was having these really intense pains. So there is that. And finally, the last question from Chakra Gosha, and also the last question tonight, is on an old episode of the Right Wing Dharma Squad's podcast, the guys argued that it is virtuous, or better than neutral, for Buddhist lay people to have children because birth as a human is the most fortunate kind of rebirth. So by having children, you are giving more sentient beings that opportunity. Furthermore, since you are a Buddhist, your children are virtually guaranteed to have the opportunity to hear about Dhamma, which is even more fortunate. What do you think of this argument? Is having children kusala? Well, it's pretty obvious from the Buddhist point of view that if you're able to be celibate, then you should be celibate. I mean, there are suttas where the Buddha, just said, if you're able to be celibate, be celibate. And even if you're not celibate, it's like at the very least, stay away from the wives of other men. So, um, yeah, I think they're pushing it. They're in a way it's sort of justification, or what's it called? Casuistry. Is that what it is? Casuistry, where you're trying to justify, pretty much anything you want to do. And whether something is moral or immoral really does depend upon the individual's mental states. So, I mean, two people can have children. One person over here and another person over there can each have their children, and one person will be just a lousy father and make all sorts of akusala. The other person will be a good father and make all sorts of merit. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of warnings, like the Daniya Sutta in the Sutta Nipata. It's like Mara wants you to have kids. It's like children are like a huge attachment. I had a friend of mine a long time ago when he had a little kid, and he said when a toddler even walks towards a street, he can be still 30 feet back, but I mean, there's just this visceral, this dread of the little kid just splattering, just jumping out in front of traffic or something. And so, yeah, I think they're trying to justify what they would prefer anyway. Um, but I mean, if you're going to have children, I mean, there should be no regrets, and to some degree, it can be a rewarding experience and a valuable ascetic practice in certain respects. But yeah, your attachments are going to increase almost certainly. Um, so there is that. So I would say, I mean, some people, they might do better with children than without children, and some people won't. It depends on the individual, which is kind of a cop-out answer, but it is true. And let's see, with regard to these last parts here, by having children, you're giving more sentient beings the opportunity of human birth. Yeah, I mean, you could twist that around, and a murderer could say, it's their karma. Like, I'm helping them to pay off their karmic debts. It really doesn't work that way. It's abstractifying your karma, whereas your actual karma, like the wholesome or unwholesome quality of it, is just what's going on in your mind. Is your will, and not like any kind of abstract future possible states. So I mean, if you can have children and stay relatively detached, or um, you're cultivating more love and care and compassion and so forth than the negative or unskillful states, then yeah, it could be beneficial. Although I think for most people, um, it kind of keeps them more firmly in samsara as a general rule. So that is the last question. And before I sign off, I'll just remind you all to look at the URL links in the bottom, and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and smash that like button and stuff, and be happy.